Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist finishing up 2 years of teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, before moving in fall 2017 home to the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm back today with another video about a topic in Norse language and myth, and what I want to do today is give you a brief overview of what our sources about Norse myth actually are. In any field, it's important to know the genealogy of your information. You want to get as close to the original collector of the data as you can. And in our case, the data is authentic pre-Christian traditions of mythology and religion from Scandinavia. Iceland, the country where most of our sources come from, became Christian in the year 1000, and the first manuscripts that we have written down from Iceland are from the year 1150. So there's already a significant gap between when the last people were actually worshiping these gods and when we have sources that write stories about them. That being the case, the earlier the sources are, the more likely they are to reflect some actually transmitted authentic tradition. So let's look at what some of these are. One kind of source that we can be reasonably confident is actually older in origin than the manuscripts that it's written in would be early poems. Consider that Shakespeare could be written in the early 1600s, but of course you can print a textbook with Shakespeare's poems today in 2017. So in the same way, poems can be remembered and written down much later than their actual date of composition. Since poems have constraints on their language, in a lot of modern English poetry, the constraint is meter and rhyme, right? This particular meter or rhythm, and there are particular rhymes you have to keep. In the case of Old Norse poetry, the constraint is usually a very different kind of meter than we use, and then alliteration, so words start with the same sound. Those constraints tend to keep poetry from changing as much in oral transmission as regular language or prose does. And linguists who study how a particular language changes over time can often do a reasonably good job of dating poetry because, for instance, you could only have certain rhymes at certain times in a language that was an unintentional rhyme. For instance, someone in English rhyming the name Mary with Merry, like Merry Christmas, and marry somebody, that rhyme would probably be 20th century or later, because in the 19th century, probably most Americans and speakers in Britain did not have the same vowel in those three words. It said marry, Mary, and Mary. So linguists can take poetry and often do a pretty good job of dating it, and so we can be reasonably confident that even if a poem is written down in a much later manuscript, that it may in fact be much older. So the Poetic Edda is one of our number one sources for Norse myth. The Poetic Edda is a compilation of poems that were written down in Iceland in 1270, although even that manuscript is probably a copy of an earlier manuscript from about 1200. But these poems often have linguistic features that suggest they are much earlier, in fact, going back often, although not always, to the Viking Age. The Poetic Edda, if I were to choose any one source of Norse myth to be familiar with from the primary sources, I would say the Poetic Edda, because it contains the narratives that underlie our entire understanding of Norse myth today. For instance, there's the poem Völuspá, which concerns the creation of the world and its famous destruction at Ragnarok. There's Hávamál, which concerns the wisdom of the god Odin and some of his mysteries, like how he sacrificed himself to himself. There are also poems where we get to know other gods, like Lokasenna, where Loki insults all the gods. The insults often seem to be true. Or there's Horbasljóð, where Thor and Odin have a disagreement. Or there's lighthearted things like Thrimskvida, where Thor has to dress up in a wedding dress to go get back his stolen hammer Mjolnir. About half the Poetic Edda actually doesn't concern the gods per se. It concerns the human heroes who are also subjects of myths, especially Sigurður the Dragon Slayer, his wife Gudrun, and her brothers Gunnar and Hogni. And those stories feed the saga of the Volsungs, which I'll also mention a little bit later. So the Poetic Edda, very important. Despite the late date of the manuscript, the poems probably are our best surviving traditional material about the Norse gods. There are also Skaldak poems. So the style of the poems in the Poetic Edda is fairly simple. There's a basic meter there's alliteration in the lines, but there's not a lot of complicated poetic stuff going on. Skaldic poetry is something quite different. The kings and jarls of the Viking Age preferred a very strict kind of poetry. One of the strictest meters is called drotkvat, the courtly meter, the meter for kings. And these Skaldic poems were so demanding with what syllables had to rhyme with each other, what syllables had to end with the same consonants, what syllables had to start with the same consonants, etc., and so demanding with their metrical placement of syllables that it was very difficult to write natural Old Norse. You basically had to twist words, you had to make kennings, which are complicated metaphors, you had to use heities, which are elusive names for things. And these kennings and heiti that are used to reword things can often contain hints about myths. The Skaldic poems are rarely about myths. Only in a very couple cases does a Skaldic poem tell a myth, and usually that's because it's describing some object of art that has a myth painted on it, like a shield has a scene of Thor fishing for the Midgard Serpent or something like that. But even in the poems that don't concern myths, which is most of them, the kennings, these complex metaphors, may have references that show us that a particular myth is old. So if we read about it in the Poetic Edda, let's use the example of Thor fishing for the Midgard Serpent. In that poem, Thor puts an ox head, a steer head, on a fishing hook and throws that out into the ocean, and that's what he uses as bait for the Midgard Serpent to bite. So if a Skaldic poem refers to a steer's head as the bait of Thor, then we have a reference to that myth, even if it's indirect. What's valuable about this is that Skaldic poetry is so strict that it's even easier to date. Sometimes, because of the strictness of the meter, it can be dated within about 50 years. Also, since the Skaldic poems often are made in memory of a particular battle or in memory of a particular king, those events and lives can also help us date Skaldic poems very exactly. So even if there's a poem in the Poetic Edda where we're not very confident about its age, if the myth that it tells is referred to in a Skaldic poem that we are very confident is very old, that makes us much more confident about that story in the Poetic Edda. Speaking of the Poetic Edda, there's also the Prose Edda, and this is the work of the Icelandic chieftain Snorri Sturluson, who lived from 1178 or 1179 to 1241. It is often misunderstood because Poetic Edda and Prose Edda get mixed up. People look at the word prose and they think of something like poetry, because we often use that in English today to mean like flowery language, when all it means is that it's not poetry. It almost means the opposite of what we sort of assume it means today. But the Prose Edda is a very different book. This is not a collection of poems, rather Snorri's writing about poems. So Snorri Sturluson, writing in this case probably around the 1220s in Iceland, was disappointed with the way that new European models of poetry were becoming popular in Iceland in his time. People weren't writing these traditional Skaldic poems anymore. They were writing these French-like or English-like ballads, and Snorri wanted to preserve that old art. So he set out to write his Edda as a handbook for explaining how to compose these Skaldic poems. And so we started out by explaining the meters, some of these kennings, these metaphors, and heiti, these elusive names for things. But he also had to explain many of the myths and the overall system of the gods and their worlds in order to make a lot of those references make sense. And so the part of the Prose Edda called Gylfaginning is his frame story about a king named Gylfi who was deceived by the Aesir, or rather Odin himself, conceived as a trinity, high, just as high in third. And in that deception, it is explained to him all the various myths about the gods that Snorri seems to have known. Often Snorri quotes poems from the Poetic Edda. When he quotes them, they are rarely in exactly the same form as they appear in our manuscript of the Poetic Edda, suggesting either that Snorri had a different manuscript or that he knew them by oral transmission, which is interesting in and of itself. But Snorri largely agrees with the Poetic Edda. Not always, but he largely agrees with it. He tells some stories that fill in gaps in the Poetic Edda, things that are referred to in the Poetic Edda but not explained there. Like, for instance, the way that Loki turned into a mare to give birth to Odin's horse Sleipnir. It's kind of a long story. I ought to make a video about that. But also Snorri, he tries to make things a little bit too systematic. Very often people complain today because there's such an emphasis, it seems like, especially in internet communities, on getting, the quote, pure Norse myths. People complain about Christian influence in Snorri. Is Snorri making things too Christian? If he is, the main way he's making things too Christian is in making them too cohesive. He's a medieval Christian, right? He's writing in the 1220s. Iceland's been Christian for 220 years, about as long as America's been independent of Great Britain. And he wants the pre-Christian religion to be like his Christian religion in the sense that there is one way that things are true. There is a dogma, there's an orthodox truth to it, where there almost certainly wasn't. Probably pre-Christian religion differed greatly from place to place and time to time in the Viking Age across Scandinavia. But Snorri wants to have it one way. He doesn't want all these conflicting traditions. So he's kind of making it more cohesive than it probably was. But he's a very valuable testament. And he also writes a history of the kings of Norway, which is divided into several different sagas about these different kings. And the very first saga in this history of the kings of Norway, called Heimskringla, is Ynglinga saga, about the Ynglings, the sort of ancestral royal family. And of course, the ancestors of the royal family are the gods. In both the Prose Edda and in Ynglinga saga, Snorri tries to explain the gods away as being human beings who were misinterpreted as, or who misrepresented themselves as, gods. In particular, he's fond of this notion that they were Trojans. Now, all over Europe during the Middle Ages, as classical literature was being rediscovered in the High Middle Ages especially, everybody wanted to be the Trojans, right? The Greeks defeated the Trojans, and then who did the Trojans become? And everybody, the British were the Trojans, the Irish were the Trojans, the Albanians were the Trojans, everybody was the Trojans. But Snorri says, no, the Norse gods were the Trojans. He explains, this word Asir, which is the name for the main family of the gods, as meaning people of Asia. It's not true, but it sounded good to him and apparently to other people in the Middle Ages. And it also gave him a way to talk about the Norse gods for his Christian audience without sounding like he was advocating the worship of these pre-Christian gods or being too sympathetic to it. He's saying, no, these were deluded human beings. So we have to kind of sift out Snorri's pseudo-historical explanation about the gods, but both these books do give us good information. And interestingly, Ynglinga saga and the Prose Edda don't always agree in the way that he presents them. Ynglinga saga actually often seems like it's a little bit closer to older traditions. Snorri wasn't alone in trying to historicize, or euhemerize is the word that we typically use for making gods into human beings in narratives. There are also other little fragments out there. There's one interesting fragment called Brot Fornan Otrunad, a fragment about ancient superstition, which is from a manuscript from the 1300s, but looks like it may be an origin perhaps a little bit earlier than Snorri. And in it, there's a little bit of very confused discussion about the Egyptian and Babylonian gods, also about the Norse gods. But this repeats this thing about them being Trojans from Asia. The Brot Fornan Otrunad is an exclusive translation reward on my Patreon page. If you haven't checked out my Patreon page, check it out. You'll find that and some other exclusive translations too. There are also some sagas that tell us about the Norse gods. The word saga is often over-applied in discussing Norse literature of the Middle Ages. A saga is technically just prose. It's a pre-novel. It's not written in poetry. And the sagas typically concern human heroes, but some of the Fornaldarsögur, the sagas about ancient times, as they're called, are sort of entwined with the gods, especially the sagas about the Volsungs, which, remember, the Poetic Edda is half concerned with, the human hero of the family called the Volsungs. The saga of the Volsungs features constant meddling by the god Odin, and its fanfic sequel, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, has a couple references to the gods too. I have translated the saga of the Volsungs and the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. That'll be available in September, so look for that. And other sagas that mention the gods include the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, where Odin has a riddle contest with a king. There's Gautrek saga, where Odin demands a sacrifice to himself after Odin and Thor trade off blessing and cursing a particular human hero. There is Hrolfsaga Kraka, which features Odin testing the army of King Hrolfr of Denmark. There are several sagas that have just sort of these incidental presences of gods. Rarely ever are these sagas sort of about the gods, but they do give us insights into their characters that do line up for the most part with what we read about them in the Eddas. As for sources that actually survived from the Viking Age, didn't the Vikings write anything down? They did, but it was largely in runes in the younger Futhark runic alphabet, and these are very rarely long inscriptions, and they're very rarely religious in content. Most runic inscriptions either just have the alphabet or they have a very mundane something like the name of the person, either who owns something or who made something. They are sometimes in memorial stones. You know, this was raised by so-and-so in memory of so-and-so. There are simple, basically like shopping lists and the brigand inscriptions, things like that. Rarely is the content very interesting, but occasionally runic inscriptions do mention gods. We especially see the expression Thor Vigi, may Thor bless, on some inscriptions. This is interesting because that same verb, viga, to bless, is used about Thor's hammer in the poem Thrymskvida in the Poetic Edda. And then there are some inscriptions, I can think of one at least, that mentions the god Odin, although it's not very clear what the context is. That's his name and what on a human skull, along with the word for dwarf and something about a headache. These inscriptions can sometimes be sort of puzzles. And then there are also some inscriptions that refer to the runes as Ragina Kundu, that is like known by the gods or with godly power. A word that is actually used of them in the poem Havamal in the Poetic Edda. So there's a little bit in runes, but not much. There are also names. If we consider the names of places in Scandinavia, often they contain the names of gods, especially Thor, Freyr, Njordr, Odin, someone named Ullr or Ullin. We don't know very much about him. He's barely mentioned in the Eddas. Sometimes just the word Os, which means God. Some very famous places in Scandinavia have the names of gods in them. One of the most significant is Odense in Denmark, which is from Old Norse Odensve, Odin's holy place or shrine. Oslo might have the name Os for a god in it. That Os may also just mean river mouth. It depends on how you explain Oslo. And then, of course, many people's names in the Viking Age and later contain gods' names too, especially Thor. There's also, elsewhere in Scandinavia, there was a fellow named Saxo Grammaticus, also my ska band, right? Saxo Grammaticus finished the first books of his Gesta Danorum, or History of the Danes, Deeds of the Danes, around 1215. And the first 9 books or so of this book, it is sort of like Snorri's Heimskringla, which is the history of the kings of Norway, but this history of the kings of Denmark does go back into sort of prehistoric times and deals with the gods. Saxo is much less sympathetic to the idea about pre-pagan, pre-Christian gods than Snorri is. He presents them as much darker and their worshippers as much dumber. But some of his stories are strikingly similar to the stories that we see in the Eddas, and sometimes strikingly different. I've discussed in my video about the death of Baldur just how different the story Saxo tells about that is. It's really striking. But Saxo is important for showing us that there were some other traditions still surviving into the 1200s, and sometimes he provides important corroborating evidence for things we read about in the Eddas. So from this survey, you can see that we don't have anything like a Bible. We don't even really have anything quite as compendious as like Ovid's Metamorphoses. We're really kind of piecing things together from disparate sources. Do we wish that it was otherwise? Sure, but we have to work with what we've actually got. If you read secondary sources about Norse myth and religion that are not drawing their information explicitly from these primary sources from the Middle Ages, consider for a moment what the author's agenda might be, and whether this might just be the product of the author's imagination rather than something that is actually extrapolating from the original materials that really do survive from the oldest manuscripts and runic inscriptions available to us. If you haven't yet and you're interested in checking out the Poetic Edda, I have a translation that was published in 2015 by Hackett Publishing Company, followed in 2017 by my translation of the Saga of the Volsungs and Ragnar Lothbrok that's coming out in September. The Prose Edda is available in a few translations. Out of the ones available, I recommend the one by Anthony Fawkes. If you're looking for secondary sources that sum up the Norse myths well, I would look at a new book by Carolyn Larrington. This is called The Norse Myths. That gives you a nice summary about what we know. For now, from the University of California, Berkeley, I'm hoping this was useful to you, and I'm wishing you all the best.